Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're still waiting for a few more people to join, so we'll start probably in about 2 or 3 minutes. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's TBR webinar series. I'm Allan Krans. I'm the practice manager for cloud and software. With me today presenting will be Jack McElwee, as well as Catie Merrill, a research analyst covering the cloud and software space. Today we'll be discussing partnerships around cloud, and the webinar Cloud Pairs Well with Partners. Before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping notes. If you look at the bottom of your screens, you'll see a series of buttons. From left to right, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, our survey, and social sharing. After the webinar, you'll get an email with a replay link, as well as that you can view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions, you can submit them as we go through the session. We typically take them at the end. You can also reach out to us after the webinar at webinars@tbri.com. And without further ado, we'll get started. So here you have contact information for me as well as the other presenters. Feel free to reach out if you have questions or follow-ups based on what's discussed today. Really, at any time, please do that. And then before we get started, just want to orient to where some of the content will be coming from for today's session. So within our cloud and software coverage, we focus a lot on the individual vendors within this space. And so for a lot of the alliance activity and partnerships, we'll be drawing from our ongoing coverage of the leading providers in cloud and software that we cover on an individual basis. We'll also be looking a little bit more broadly, leveraging some of our benchmarks, which look at markets, take a market view. For instance, the public cloud benchmark is where a lot of the coverage that cuts across the major infrastructure, platform, and software as a service vendors is derived from. And then the last area, kind of rounding it out, will be insight from our customer studies. We just published our applications cloud customer study recently, and the infrastructure and platforms report will be published next month, early next month. But we already have some of that insight, and so you'll hear some early feedback from customers for those types of workloads as we go through today's session. So that gives you a little idea what we're drawing from in terms of today's presentation. I will draw your attention a little bit to, we have 2 new market landscapes that we're concept testing at this point, but should be in a good position to launch early next year, if not late this year. The first one is a cloud expense and profit market landscape, kind of looking at the business model for some of the leading cloud providers in terms of their expenses and levels of profitability and how they're managing those. And then an edge and fog compute market landscape, which looks at the market opportunity for edge computing use cases and how that's being approached strategically from the colocation provider, cloud provider, as well as the hardware vendor aspects. So we'll be looking at that from a market perspective as it develops, and have seen a lot of interest in our clients for insight into that space because it is so new and emerging. So those are two new additions that should be coming out later this year or early next. So to get into today's topic, really just kind of taking a step back and looking at what role partnerships have played in cloud, I think is important because it hasn't always been a big part of the overall strategy and business model for a lot of the leading providers in the space. For the most part, the Salesforces and Amazons that kind of founded the industry largely took a direct go-to-market approach and may have had partners from the beginning, but didn't do a lot to nurture those partnerships and ecosystems in the way that we saw with traditional software and IT overall. So it is a bit of a change in terms of the overall strategy. And so we'll look at kind of three views into exactly how that's manifesting. The first is looking at the customer trend towards more hybrid solutions and how environments with multiple cloud vendors, integration to on-premise assets, and really a lot more of a solution focus are demanding from vendors that there's more functionality that crosses different vendor boundaries, works together from a technology perspective as well as a service perspective in terms of really turning technology into solutions. So hybrid, I think, plays a big role in terms of the growing focus on partnerships as part of the cloud go-to-market strategy. The second area, we'll look specifically at cloud marketplaces because we do see them playing an important role in the overall strategy for a lot of cloud vendors. And in terms of nurturing the ecosystem, it's one of the ways that a lot of formerly direct-focused vendors are working more with the ISV partners to develop solutions and cater to customer requirements in terms of functionality and specialization. And then lastly, we'll take a look at kind of the service aspect of partnerships and the role that services can play in terms of, again, wrapping business value around technology implementations and solutions, and also filling a gap that a lot of customers have around the scarcity of skills really across the board for IT, but in particular with a lot of new technologies, cloud included. It's a challenge for customers of all sizes, really, where partners can play a role in offsetting some of that challenge and issue that we see prevalent around skills in the market. So that gives you kind of the three topics. We'll dive into the first one, kind of looking at the role that hybrid plays. And so on the top, we kind of have a typical customer evolution of the ways that they've used cloud as part of their overall IT strategy. Certainly starting with public cloud, a lot of unsanctioned activity where it may focus on a single vendor, but it's very spread out throughout a customer environment, not central or coordinated. And largely that's historical for most customers that we talk with, that they've moved to a more consolidated effort around public cloud and have a good grasp around private as well. I think for a lot of customers, the way to put it is they may be moving things to public cloud, but they're at least aware of the benefits that private options can provide them, whether it's hosted or on-prem. So a lot more consideration and awareness for private, even if it is shifted to eventually a public cloud environment. And then really for almost all of the customers that we interact with, some level of hybrid cloud where they have multiple cloud environments that are orchestrated together, and a lot more hybrid IT where they're integrating some of the on-prem assets, adding cloud into that landscape, but not going wholesale with a cloud environment. So a lot of things are going to remain on-prem, but they can be enhanced with additional cloud solutions or partial cloud delivery. And so that most customers are well into that aspect of adoption. And so if we look at how the challenges have changed, really across the bottom, I think most customers have found themselves dealing with the complexity of multiple different solutions within their environment. Culture, I think, has shifted to a large degree, but remains an ongoing challenge to balance new skills and new approaches in terms of IT. And then for most customers, they're looking at not just technology, but transformation. So really taking an end-to-end look at the business process that's supported by those IT decisions, and finding ways to derive business benefit from any shift in terms of the delivery that they might put in place. So with those challenges, it sets up the need for those additional services. So being able to address the complexity really starts with upfront consulting and advisory. There's still a lot of revenue being derived from service partners there, but it's ongoing throughout the implementation and then on the back end, the managed services. And Catie will hit on some of that as we deep dive into that service aspect. So that gives you a sense for just holistically how most customers are shifting to a hybrid cloud and hybrid IT environment, and are dealing with much more difficult parts of that migration rather than just initial upfront cost or security or optimization in terms of the assets that they're using. It goes much deeper into the business process. So we also have a little bit of insight, as I said, from our customer research. So this is new just out of the freshly published report. And Jack will take us through a little bit of kind of support and a deeper dive into how customers are expanding their use of multi-vendor environments and multi-vendor solutions as part of their cloud strategy.
Thanks, Allan. So looking into this graph, whether these vendors will increase or customers will increase the number of vendors they use, you can see that there in orange. Whether they plan to stay the same is in red, or decrease in purple. And you can see that from the second half of 2018 to the first half of 2019, companies plan to increase the number of vendors in their IT environments across all three layers of infrastructure, platform, and software as a service. And in the infrastructure as a service space, it went from 29% of respondents to 43% who plan to increase their usage. And reasons being for this is that companies may look to set up their infrastructure as a service environments using vendors that have unique services. One example of that would be Google, which has a particularly strong skill set around AI and machine learning, or Microsoft Windows Server customers who may be more inclined to stay within the Microsoft ecosystem and migrate to Azure. These companies also want to hold negotiating power, and to increase that, they're using multiple infrastructure as a service vendors, and that prevents the vendor lock-in. Acquisitions create a multi-vendor environment as well, from the infrastructure and platform as a service perspective, when the acquiree is being built on a different vendor than the company that's making the acquisition. Some companies may migrate the acquiree onto their platform, but they are more than likely going to create integrations and keep that hybrid environment. From a software as a service perspective, you'll see there was a pretty significant change between these two time periods. And in the number of respondents that said they plan to increase the number of apps in their IT environment, this is where we expect to see the most significant use of multiple vendors, as each software as a service vendor holds a particularly strong value proposition in certain areas. For example, Salesforce has a strong CRM business, but doesn't really have a back office. So customers need to look to other vendors like Workday for a back office function that complements their CRM. And diving a little bit deeper into our research, more than a quarter of customers currently only have one SaaS vendor, but nearly the same proportion of customers have 5 or more vendors in their IT environment. And more than half of respondents expect their SaaS vendor landscape to expand further in the next 2 years. So the lack of single vendor SaaS environments indicate that offering best-of-breed functionality is a more valuable investment for vendors than offering the native integration available in full suite portfolios from brands like NetSuite and Zoho, as well as the broadening portfolios we're seeing for Microsoft, SAP, and Oracle. Those are more coming from acquisitions. And Microsoft 365 is one of the most ubiquitous SaaS solutions currently deployed, but multi-vendor expectations indicate customers will look to other vendors for business apps rather than Microsoft's dynamic suite. Similarly, we expect SAP will be more widely adopted for SaaS ERP, but its front office apps endeavors will not unseat Salesforce's footprint, but I'll get a little bit more into that on the next slide. And here we're looking at kind of coopetition between vendors. At the infrastructure and platform level, we have VMware and AWS. Two vendors have been working together with VMware Cloud on AWS for a while now. VMware has a large legacy customer base that wants to migrate to the cloud, and AWS's infrastructure as a service is the most pervasive, kind of making it the strongest option for an infrastructure as a service vendor. And from AWS's point of view, this has been a massive customer base that the company can tap into and gain those infrastructure as a service revenues. And the vendors will continue to integrate their solutions to make it easier for VMware customers to migrate to AWS. And VMware Cloud on AWS is going to become available on AWS Outposts, which really speaks to the hybrid theme, since a multi-cloud offering will be available to run in a multi-cloud environment between AWS data centers and behind customers' walls. And while VMware may have started with AWS, it is broadening its reach, partnering with Microsoft and Oracle recently as well. So within the Microsoft and VMware space, Microsoft has partnered with VMware to develop Azure VMware solutions, which enables joint Microsoft and VMware customers to extend or migrate VMware workloads to Azure, as well as develop solutions for Azure VMware hybrid IT environments. They're unifying Microsoft 365 and VMware Workspace ONE as well, which will help customers' employees leverage Office 365 across their devices. And Microsoft and Oracle, around the same time, have made a partnership to integrate Azure and Oracle Cloud. And they're really focusing on running Oracle apps and databases across the two vendors' clouds. This is a good example of coopetition between vendors because as they continue to compete, we think this alliance is going to help the vendors compete with AWS, where Microsoft and AWS clearly go head-to-head, and Oracle and AWS compete in the database space. And that partnership between Microsoft and VMware is also a shot across the bow of AWS. Since it's similar to VMware and AWS's partnership, where Microsoft is now competing with AWS for VMware's customer base.
And I just want to quickly touch upon IBM's relationship with Red Hat. While it's technically no longer an alliance since IBM completed its purchase this past July, it's definitely a relationship still worth noting, given all this opportunity for IBM. And all that opportunity is really around hybrid. Specifically, this is being done at the platform level with Red Hat's OpenShift. And what this does is OpenShift has the ability to run on multiple clouds. So unlike before, you're seeing Red Hat help IBM take a more agnostic approach in the sense that it doesn't really matter where you run OpenShift as long as you're running it. And we think that will help IBM solidify its on-premises play as well.
And shifting towards the applications and analytics space, one of the really large partnerships, cooperative partnerships that we've been seeing is Adobe, Microsoft, and SAP, where they've been working on their open data initiative for the past year, which is a partnership focused around the front office. They're unifying, or creating a unified data model for Adobe's Experience Cloud, Microsoft Dynamics 365, and SAP C4HANA, which are their front office suites. And each of the vendors have overlapping apps that compete with each other, but as I mentioned before, customers aren't going for that single vendor environment. And as joint customers of these three vendors, we're looking for some synergies. And moving forward, these synergies are what will really enable the vendors to compete with Salesforce. Individually, they don't have a strong portfolio as Salesforce, since Salesforce has been developing its front office portfolio for the past 20 years, but together as a unified front, they're better able to compete with the front office market leader. And you can see that there's a trend with some of the largest vendors teaming up to compete with the top player in the market, whether it's Salesforce in the front office SaaS space or AWS in infrastructure and database.
Yeah, I think overall that's a good point for Jack to close on, because a lot of the alliances that we just went through come as a result of, in some ways, failed attempts to be competitive in certain areas of the market. If you look at Oracle and VMware, for instance, partnering with a lot of the leading cloud providers, they've at various points tried their own competitive cloud strategies, didn't have the scale to, or Oracle's is ongoing, but either don't yet or didn't have the scale to really mount a strong competitive threat for leadership in some of those markets. And so we're looking at alternative ways to have a different cloud strategy, but still one that they can benefit from overall customer investment around cloud themes. And in some ways it speaks to the broadening opportunity for cloud, where it's not just who's going to be the biggest infrastructure as a service platform. There's a lot of different ways to make money. Part of it comes from their legacy on-prem base that can be either transitioned or made compatible with cloud delivery, and so they're taking those routes. So a lot of this co-opetition is not because they really want to work with their competitors. It's because that's the best path forward for them, and so it's taking the form of a partnership and alliance.
Great. Thanks, Allan. So moving forward, so that was really looking at the hybrid environment and co-opetition between vendors, as Allan was just mentioning. Moving forward, we're going to look at cloud marketplaces, which generally speaking is where customers go to find vendors, ISV, and consulting partners. And rather than having a competitive aspect like we were just talking about, these marketplace partners really complement a vendor's portfolio and go-to-market strategy. So customers want to complement the core services of vendors' offerings, like those of the vendors we see here, with ancillary offerings from ISVs, and the marketplace is a great place to do that. These partners already have their apps integrated with the vendor's core services, making it an easy adoption for customers and enabling those customers to find apps that address the niche use cases or fill gaps in the vendor's portfolio. And Salesforce launched its marketplace in 2005 before other cloud leaders had even been established here. This has given Salesforce a long runway to build out its marketplace with a large base of partners, which offer solutions that improve Salesforce's apps, one example being like Sales Cloud. And they also provide apps for customers' broader IT environments, since Salesforce only meets customers' front office needs. And while AWS offers a broader infrastructure and as a service and PaaS portfolio, the vendor largely focuses on infrastructure as a service, and because of that, has a widely horizontal portfolio. So this is kind of differing from Salesforce in terms of how they are using their market. because AWS is more horizontal, they are using partners to address those industry needs. So they're developing competencies for specific industries, which has been going on for the past year or so. And Google and Microsoft are more of a mix between these two vendors, since they provide solutions that span infrastructure, platform, and software as a service. Overall, these apps address customers' broader needs to meet existing demand, but they also supply apps that will attract new customers and bring more revenue into the vendor's ecosystem, as opposed to the customer looking outside of the vendor's ecosystem for a suitable provider for that broader IT environment need. So that's bringing more revenue to the Salesforces and Microsofts of the world, keeping those broader workloads on their platforms. And professional services partners, as I mentioned, are also helping these four vendors carry out customer engagements. Vendors don't have as large of a presence across all geographies, and services partners are around. They're able to use their customer base and their consultants, implementers, to carry out customer engagements that they're unable to do themselves in that geography. Also, just because their customer bases are growing so large at this point, they're able to use partners to scale at a faster rate, since they're able to leverage their resources. And kind of broadly speaking about the marketplaces, Salesforce has been innovating around AppExchange Marketplace for the past almost 20 years. So it is capabilities that go beyond these other vendors, like how customers can search for and find potential employees with Salesforce certifications that they need. So that's something that we'll probably be seeing with the other vendors in the near future.
Okay, great. So the other side of Marketplace that when we're kind of looking at this area overall is we want to put some numbers to, revenue that's actually being driven through the Marketplace, just to have that financial perspective of their role and the impact that they're having. So when we looked at all the different marketplaces available, kind of the traction, and then extrapolated that to the overall cloud as well as software markets, we found that about 7% of revenue, we believe, is actually driven through these online cloud marketplaces. So it's not a majority of revenue by any means. That said, it has been certainly a growing area if you think about just how long they've been available, and to take up 7% of the market. There has been a fairly significant amount of growth that's kind of been complemented by the shift to online procurement of IT through cloud and the whole public cloud shadow IT type trend. So there's definitely been a market developed around these marketplaces. However, I think a lot of the impact for marketplaces as an overall group comes in other forms. As I mentioned before, for a lot of the cloud platform vendors, the challenge for them is to get as much activity and customers consuming resources on those platforms as they can. And having third-party software titles is a great way for them to do that. So it nurtures the ISV ecosystem. It's a way that partnerships are really kind of taking form in the cloud space. And so I think there's a lot of important aspects there. A lot of deals could, in fact, if solutions are designed to run on a certain cloud platform through the marketplace program, there are other deals that could take place directly or outside of the marketplace and involve other components a lot of times. So there's a lot of ways to monetize the investment that ISVs are making in terms of developing and integrating into different marketplace models. So there's that aspect. From the last aspect to kind of touch on is gets that trend around customers looking for not just the best technology, but the right technology that will give them the business outcome that they're looking for. And so solutioning is a really important theme. It's still very difficult for a lot of customers to sort through all of the solutions and technology that's available to find the best one. And so marketplaces provide at least a framework for the types of solutions based on industry, based on business model, based on the type of technology that customers are looking for, to work as a starting place to bring together multiple different elements that would have been more difficult for them to design on their own, to have something that more quickly gets to really the underlying business case they're trying to address. So solutioning is really important, and we see a lot of the developments in marketplaces being focused around healthcare verticals, manufacturing verticals, IoT capabilities, things that are designed to run together are an important part of bringing together not just the ISV ecosystem into a solutions aspect, but catering to customers in the way that they're wanting to consume these services going forward. And so that's an additional benefit that in the end, very well could accelerate sales cycles and increase the impact of investments by customers. So it has the potential to be good all around. And so those are some of the things that Salesforce has its own ecosystem. It's going to stand on its own in terms of the business model. But for most of the other vendors, it's about getting more usage on top of their platforms. And there's a couple different ways outside of just the direct transaction revenue that they're able to do that, leveraging marketplaces as a tool. And so we'll move on to the last area and have Catie deep dive around some of the service partnerships and opportunities there.
Okay, thank you, Allan. So here in our final discussion, we're really going to talk about how there's a wide skills gap in the IT sector, specifically among cloud, and how this presents a lot of opportunity for professional services vendors, looking more specifically at managed service providers as well as advisory, strategy, and consulting firms as well. On top of that, we'll kind of look into how this growing adoption of hybrid places even more emphasis on these vendors and how it's going to make these players really appealing partners to go to market with. So the key takeaway here is the graph, which we derived from our cloud applications customer research. And essentially, it highlights that advisory, strategy, and consulting services have the highest adoption rates among customers. The margin isn't huge in comparison to the other three services categories we define in our taxonomy, but it is worth noting that these are definitely popular among customers. Large vendors like Accenture and more pure play consultants like Deloitte really kind of blow other benchmarked services providers away, at least in terms of consulting revenue. But these two incumbents are really more trusted advisors around broader strategic initiatives. And the quote that you can see on the slide as well, which we also pulled from our research, kind of highlights this. While it's true that Accenture and Deloitte are really good at what they do, when it comes down to it, they're very expensive. So it's definitely not for every consumer. And it highlights opportunity for some of the smaller second-tier consultants who can service customers at a much more favorable price point. In addition to that, systems integration vendors, so the likes of DXC, Atos, and Cognizant, are focusing more on the hybrid opportunity that we're talking about here. And throughout we've kind of highlighted that hybrid is where the IT landscape is headed. So there's also huge opportunity for these vendors in terms of partnerships as well. So, like advisory and consulting, managed services is definitely a space to watch out for. We think even more so among hosted private cloud adopters. We're finding these customers are kind of in a middle ground in terms of autonomy, in the sense that they're running a private environment, but they still don't have the skills to do everything internally. So again, the margin is pretty thin, but hosted private cloud customers we think are slightly likely more to adopt these managed services compared to, say, a self-built private cloud customer who likely already has those resources in-house to manage their operations. And another key thing we found when conducting our research was that these smaller firms were really the ones who were more likely to adopt managed services. We're finding smaller cloud vendors may have a really competitive technology, but they just can't compete with the Fortune 500 in terms of resources. So I think we're seeing managed services becoming more of a necessity compared to a luxury in terms of these smaller vendors in order to kind of take that competition away. So in summary, I mean, there will be a small portion of customers who will want to keep everything in-house, but I think the majority are really going to outsource their services to, in a lot of ways, control costs and kind of consume that third-party expertise, especially as hybrid continues to dominate the IT landscape, and these vendors become increasingly helpful in navigating these integration and management challenges.
Yeah, and I think just drawing from a couple interviews around that area, for some customers, Catie mentioned hosted private. That's a kind of logical transition for one case we were talking with a higher education institution that said they had distributed data centers. A lot of departments had their own research clusters that were built up, and it just had a strong feeling that they wanted to maintain that model. So they shifted to a hosted private model using co-location so that they could still have more connection to the actual infrastructure than if it went to a public cloud environment. But the intent was to gradually get them used to less connection to the actual infrastructure and leverage managed services to get them back focused on the outcome of the research, teaching, all the academic things that really they should be more focused on rather than managing IT infrastructure. So I think that was a common theme for a lot of customers where, again, it frees up their resources to focus on the true value add. If that's not going to be owning and managing their IT, then there's kind of intermediary steps, and managed services is one of them, to incrementally get them to a place where they're using more off-the-shelf, standardized type services that are managed by other people, cloud vendors, or in the interim, some of these service providers.
So this graph we pulled from our Cloud Professional Services benchmark, and again, the key takeaway here is that consulting and systems integration kind of lead in terms of revenue. And you can kind of see the growth trajectory over the past 2 years here, but we really expect that to tick up more so through 2023, which we touch upon in our professional services market forecast. We're seeing global system integrators and consultancies working even more closely with the public cloud providers, so AWS, Google, Microsoft, and even ServiceNow, to kind of help them address this hybrid market opportunity. Just to put some context around that, Atos and Google Cloud have a really interesting relationship. They recently launched the Open Hybrid solution in April, and that created an instance where Atos is fully managing those cloud-native operations. Atos currently has over 320 certified Google Cloud experts, and they expect to bring that number to over 1,000 by the end of the year. DXC is another good example of an SI working with Google Cloud. Last month, DXC became a GCP reseller, and DXC also maintains a really strong relationship with Microsoft. They recently developed an Azure practice that allows DXC to provide migration and support services for those customers looking to shift to Azure. And on top of that, some of the larger core workloads, as well as these digital transformation initiatives that we're all hearing about, are really dependent on these global SIs as well. So I think in summary, we're seeing that cloud vendors, even the likes of Amazon and Microsoft, can only take it so far in terms of achieving these business outcomes. And that is why these services partners play a really key role as they kind of come in and help manage more than that. They get down to the process and managing the people, which is really important.
Okay. Great. So that's those are 3 sections that we wanted to go through. We did have a couple questions come in as we went throughout the webinar, so we'll kind of pause, take a look at those, and respond to them live. But if there are other questions, feel free to submit them now, and we can address them live, or you can always send thoughts afterwards as well, and we try to get back to as many of those as we can. Okay. All right, so the first question is there a role for partners in reselling cloud offers? So from what we've seen, there is a role for reselling cloud offers. What I would say is that it's not presented as the primary. There's not going to be a huge value add. It's not. There'll be some margin available for partners as part of that, but compared with the traditional reselling business model, it's not going to be as high as it was, and there still needs to be a secondary or primary focus from a value add and a business model perspective. So whether that's the managed services that we were talking about, you know, complementing it with a traditional resale business can work to kind of sell in with more of a hybrid approach. So I think there's a role, but it's not a high value add, and therefore not a high level of compensation available for most partners to do that. So I think from the vendor perspective, they're really looking at focusing their partners on primarily services to sustain their business model for the long term, rather than just having a reseller focus. Let's see. There's a question around what the value of running OpenShift in other public clouds such as AWS and Azure is, especially when compared to native container platforms from Microsoft and Amazon. So from our vendor research, and I think this has come up a little bit in terms of the customer perspective. The benefit, so IBM's value prop for OpenShift is the consistency across public clouds, across private environments, across on-prem environments. So it's not necessarily trying to compete as directly with some of the native cloud container service platforms. They're really looking at providing a consistent environment for customers to leverage in terms of the capabilities, skills, performance, but also offering choice for customers to leverage some of the cloud platforms that in all reality they're most likely using in addition to the IBM environments. We haven't necessarily tested that very deeply with customers in terms of the advantages of the native container services versus OpenShift and how the environment makes a difference there. But I think that's really what they're going for, is that consistency, but also with the choice of underlying platform and delivery method is really the value prop that they're trying to use to push the OpenShift as that consistent layer for customers. Okay, so there's a question, Jack can probably chime in around this one, the acceptance of the Microsoft Dynamics 365 offering?
Yeah, I think sales has been a kind of the driver of that one, except Microsoft has also been kind of diving into some HoloLens use cases with Dynamics 365, which will be interesting to see in the coming quarters. A lot of them are around manufacturing use cases, but right now Microsoft Dynamics 365 for sales, I'd say, is the revenue driver.
Okay. Let's see, and then one final question around on slide 13, the acronym ADM.
Yes, I can take that. Yeah, ADM is Application Development and Maintenance Services. So really software maintenance concerning anything that's needed to keep your system running after it's been delivered to the end user for cloud computing. And development really being anything that, engineering, designing, implementation, maintenance, things like that.
Okay, so that kind of custom development and maintenance aspects of cloud. Let's see, and then one more question just came in. Any specific managed services that are resonating with enterprise customers? So I think from what I've seen and heard in the interviews, security to some respect is looked to. I think that's kind of a mixed bag in terms of customers that are leveraging tools in their own internal processes, but certainly managed security services came up a number of times. I also heard, I guess they're enterprise customers, but a little bit more mid-sized enterprises around things like database administration for cloud workloads, anything that can be standardized and certified, delivered from a external third party. They're looking at in terms of, so I think as more database heavy workloads move to cloud environments, that could certainly be a focal point. So I think those are two that came up just in the interviews that we've done so far. Okay, great. Well, we're out of questions. We're just about at the top of the hour, so I'll go through the closing sequence here. Thanks to everybody for joining. You can continue to submit questions. We'll leave the portal open for just a bit so that you can submit those and we can follow up with you after the webinar. You can reach out. You'll get an email with a survey as well as a replay link in case any colleagues didn't make today's live session, or if you want to go back and listen later on. And stay tuned because we have another webinar coming up next Wednesday focused on IoT in 2019, new strategies and ecosystems. So we hope you can join us again then. Thanks, everybody. Bye.